April 6, 1945. Off Okinawa's coast, a young American sailor braced for impact. The skies screamed with a new, terrifying enemy: Kamikaze. These weren't ordinary pilots. They were human missiles, transforming fear into a chilling certainty. Their desperate resolve redefined warfare, challenging every instinct for survival. To understand how it happened, we must go back to the broader context of the Pacific War, a conflict marked by unparalleled ferocity, immense distances, and a stark clash of ideologies. By late 1944, the war had raged for nearly 3 years since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, pushing American forces steadily, island by bloody island, across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Each amphibious landing, from the dense jungles of Guadalcanal to the coral reefs of Tarawa, the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, and the strategic plains of Saipan, had been a brutal testament to the Japanese soldiers' unwavering commitment to fight to the last man, often to the last breath. The American strategy of island hopping, meticulously planned and executed, was undeniably effective in bypassing heavily fortified strongholds and cutting off supply lines, but it came at an almost unimaginable cost, measured not only in lives lost and grievous injuries sustained, but also in the profound psychological toll exacted on the fighting men. The Japanese Imperial Army and Navy, though increasingly outmatched in terms of material resources, industrial capacity, and sheer numerical superiority, compensated for these deficiencies with a fanatical, almost ritualistic defense. They often preferred a glorious death in battle to the perceived dishonor of surrender, creating a brutal, attritional form of warfare where every single inch of ground, every cave, every bunker, and every ridge was contested with extreme prejudice and unyielding determination. American troops quickly learned to expect hidden snipers, elaborate tunnel systems designed for prolonged resistance, and the terrifying, often suicidal banzai charges, where Japanese soldiers, sometimes armed with little more than bayonets or even sharpened sticks, would launch desperate final assaults in a defiant, overwhelming human wave. This was the grim, visceral reality of combat against regular troops, a reality already steeped in a deep and pervasive sense of dread, a constant awareness of the enemy's willingness to die. However, as the war progressed into its final, most desperate phase for the Japanese Empire, and the American noose tightened inexorably around the Japanese home islands, a new and far more unsettling tactic emerged from the depths of desperation and a deeply ingrained cultural ethos: the kamikaze. The term itself, meaning divine wind, invoked a powerful historical precedent: the legendary typhoons that had twice miraculously saved Japan from overwhelming Mongol invasions in the 13th century. This new divine wind was intended to be a human typhoon, a last-ditch apocalyptic effort to stem the seemingly unstoppable tide of the Allied advance and protect the sacred homeland. The first organized kamikaze attacks, formerly known as the Special Attack Units, occurred during the pivotal Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Faced with the overwhelming might of the American naval power, which threatened to sever vital supply lines and isolate the Philippines, Japanese commanders under Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi authorized pilots to intentionally crash their bomb-laden aircraft directly into Allied warships. This was not merely a tactical innovation, it was a profound philosophical statement, deeply rooted in the Bushido Code, the ancient warrior's path, which emphasized honor, absolute loyalty, and ultimate self-sacrifice for the emperor and the nation. For the Japanese, it was presented as the ultimate expression of devotion, a way to inflict maximum damage with minimal remaining resources, and to die a glorious, honorable death that would ensure their place in the pantheon of national heroes. For the Americans, however, it was something entirely different, something alien and profoundly disturbing. The American fighting force, particularly the sailors and airmen of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, had, by this point, become accustomed to the brutal, yet somewhat predictable calculus of conventional warfare. They understood the enemy's ferocity, their unwavering willingness to die, but always within a framework where the enemy also sought to kill and, if possible, to survive the engagement. The kamikaze shattered this fundamental framework entirely. It introduced an enemy who actively, even eagerly, sought death as the primary and most effective means of achieving their military objective. This wasn't about outmaneuvering an opponent in a dogfight or winning a strategic engagement. It was about stopping a human-guided missile, a weapon that could not be reasoned with or deterred by the threat of its own destruction. The initial encounters with these special attack units left American personnel bewildered, horrified, and deeply disturbed. How do you effectively fight an enemy who fundamentally does not care about their own survival? How do you adequately defend against a weapon that is designed to sacrifice itself entirely, to become a living bomb? This radical shift in the nature of the threat began to rapidly erode the psychological resilience of the American forces, creating a unique and profound sense of dread that transcended the already high anxieties and stresses of combat in the Pacific. The kamikaze was not just a new, terrifying weapon. It was a psychological assault, meticulously designed to break the will of the enemy by demonstrating an absolute, terrifying, and seemingly irrational commitment to destruction. It was a challenge to the very concept of survival, a direct assault on the human instinct for self-preservation that underpins all conventional warfare. The typical American sailor or airman who found themselves deployed in the Pacific theater in the mid-1940s was a product of a nation galvanized by the sudden shock of war, yet fundamentally rooted in a culture that deeply valued individual life, personal freedom, and the inherent right to survival. Many of these servicemen were young men, barely out of their teens, who had left behind the familiar comforts of farms, bustling factories, and quiet classrooms to answer the urgent call to serve their country. Their training, rigorous and extensive, was designed to prepare them for the complex and demanding realities of modern warfare. Operating highly sophisticated machinery, mastering intricate tactical maneuvers, and understanding the rigid hierarchy of the chain of command. They were meticulously taught to fight fiercely, to protect their comrades with unwavering loyalty, and to achieve victory through skill and determination, but always with the implicit and deeply ingrained understanding that survival was a paramount objective, a goal to be pursued alongside victory. The enemy they had faced thus far, while undeniably formidable and often fanatical in their resistance, was still expected to adhere to certain recognizable combat logics, to engage in battle, to defend their positions, and ultimately to retreat or surrender when faced with overwhelming force or insurmountable odds. This understanding, however grim and brutal, provided a psychological framework for combat. Within this framework, one could anticipate an enemy's moves, counter their strategies, and even in some cases, predict their breaking point, allowing for a degree of tactical planning and psychological preparation. Their previous experiences fighting conventional Japanese forces had already forged them into hardened, battle-scarred veterans. From the suffocating humidity of the dense jungles of Guadalcanal to the desolate, ash-covered landscapes of Iwo Jima, they had faced an enemy renowned for its tenacity, its cunning, and its absolute refusal to yield. They had endured the terrifying spectacle of banzai charges, where Japanese soldiers, often with fixed bayonets and a chilling disregard for their own lives, would throw themselves against American lines in a desperate, suicidal surge. They had cleared countless hidden pillboxes, navigated treacherous booby-trapped terrain, and engaged in brutal, close-quarters, hand-to-hand combat. The dread associated with these relentless encounters was immense. The constant fear of ambush from unseen enemies, the shock of a sudden, overwhelming charge, and the grim, unsettling realization that surrender was almost never an option for the Japanese soldier. Yet, even within this extreme and profoundly dangerous environment, there was a discernible pattern, a tactical rhythm, however alien it might have seemed. Japanese soldiers, while undeniably willing to die for their emperor, still employed defensive positions, still sought to inflict casualties while attempting to preserve their own numbers where strategically possible. There was a logic, however brutal and foreign, to their resistance. American forces, with their characteristic adaptability, learned to adjust, developing specialized tactics for jungle warfare, mastering the complexities of amphibious assaults, and devising innovative methods for overcoming deeply entrenched defenses. They understood the enemy's unwavering determination, but it was a determination that still operated within the recognizable, albeit extreme, boundaries of military engagement. This established understanding, this hard-won psychological equilibrium, was about to be shattered in a way no one could have anticipated. As the war entered its final, most desperate phase for Japan, the conventional rules of engagement, the unspoken agreements of combat, began to dissolve entirely. The Japanese High Command, facing insurmountable odds, dwindling resources, and the relentless, inexorable advance of the Allied forces towards their sacred homeland, turned to increasingly radical and unconventional measures. The concept of the kamikaze, initially a spontaneous and desperate act by individual pilots, driven by patriotic fervor, was rapidly formalized into a systematic, state-sponsored strategy. This was not merely an escalation of violence or a new tactical maneuver. It was a fundamental, terrifying shift in the very nature of the threat. The American fighting man, already hardened by years of brutal combat and accustomed to facing death, was now confronted with an enemy who had deliberately discarded the most basic and universal instinct of self-preservation. The transition from fighting an enemy who sought to kill you while simultaneously trying to survive themselves to an enemy whose sole, singular purpose was to kill you by deliberately sacrificing themselves was a profound psychological leap into an abyss of dread and incomprehension. It meant that every incoming aircraft, every distant speck on the horizon, every faint engine hum carried the potential for absolute, self-immolating destruction, transforming the very act of aerial combat into a terrifying, unpredictable game of Russian roulette. The enemy was no longer just a pilot. They were a bomb with a human will, and that made them uniquely terrifying. The tactical dilemma posed by the kamikaze attacks was unprecedented in the annals of modern warfare. How does one effectively defend against an enemy whose primary singular objective is their own self-destruction in order to achieve a kill? The established rules of aerial combat, meticulously honed over decades of military aviation, simply did not apply to this new, terrifying reality. Fighter pilots were rigorously trained to dogfight, to outmaneuver their opponents, to shoot down an enemy who was also trying to shoot them down, and then, crucially, to return safely to base. Naval gunners were accustomed to targeting aircraft that would attempt evasive maneuvers, trying to avoid being hit. But a kamikaze pilot flew a direct, often unswerving, and utterly relentless course, their sole intent focused on a single, catastrophic impact. Their value was not measured in their skill as an aviator, their ability to perform complex aerial acrobatics, or their capacity for strategic thinking, but rather in their unwavering willingness to become a human-guided missile, a living projectile. This meant that traditional defensive strategies, while still employed with desperate vigor, were often tragically insufficient against such a determined, self-sacrificing foe. The psychological impact on the American forces was profound and pervasive. Every incoming aircraft, regardless of its apparent skill level or lack thereof, represented a potential death sentence for the ship and its entire crew. The constant, exhausting vigilance required, the chilling knowledge that a single, utterly determined pilot could potentially bypass all layers of defense, created an almost unbearable strain on the nerves and morale of the sailors. It was a form of warfare that stripped away any illusion of control, leaving American sailors and airmen to confront an enemy who had deliberately transcended the conventional boundaries of life and death, an enemy who had weaponized their own mortality. In the midst of this terrifying new reality, moments of decision were stark, immediate, and often agonizingly brief. Picture a young radar operator, perhaps barely out of high school, stationed in the dimly lit combat information center of a destroyer picket ship, his eyes intently scanning the green hypnotic sweep of the radar screen. Suddenly, a new blip appears, moving with alarming speed, too fast, and on a trajectory that screams hostile intent. He shouts the warning, his voice cracking with a mixture of urgency and barely suppressed fear. On the bridge, the captain, a seasoned veteran, barks rapid-fire orders, his voice cutting through the tension. The ship immediately begins to turn sharply, its powerful engines churning, while the anti-aircraft guns, massive and menacing, begin to swivel ominously towards the incoming threat. Or imagine a lone American fighter pilot patrolling high above the vast expanse of the fleet, spotting a single determined Japanese plane diving steeply and relentlessly towards a vulnerable aircraft carrier. There is no time for elaborate tactics, no room for hesitation or second-guessing. It is a desperate, frantic race against time, a desperate attempt to intercept and destroy the incoming threat before it can reach its intended target. These were not calculated strategic engagements. They were raw, split-second reactions to an immediate existential threat. The sheer speed, the unexpected nature, and the relentless frequency of the attacks, often coming in terrifying waves, left little room for rational thought, only for primal instinct, rigorous training, and desperate, immediate action. The feeling of profound helplessness, even for the most seasoned and courageous veterans, was palpable when a kamikaze managed to break through the defensive screen, its engines screaming a terrifying crescendo, its wings glinting menacingly in the sun, a horrifying harbinger of absolute destruction. The action itself, when a kamikaze attack was underway, was a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and twisted steel. As a kamikaze aircraft began its final irreversible dive, anti-aircraft guns across the entire fleet would erupt in a deafening cacophony of sound and light. Tracers, like fiery arrows, arced across the sky, forming a deadly, impenetrable lattice intended to shred the incoming plane into 1,000 pieces. The air would become thick with the acrid smell of cordite, the choking fumes of smoke, and the continuous deafening roar of explosions. Ships would maneuver wildly, their hulls groaning, attempting to present the smallest possible target to the attacker, their crews bracing themselves for the inevitable, terrifying impact. Some kamikazes, caught in the relentless barrage, would be shot down in a spectacular fiery burst, disintegrating into a shower of debris before they could reach their target, their mission tragically unfulfilled. Others, however, driven by an almost supernatural resolve, would press on, their pilots seemingly impervious to the hail of bullets, their aircraft trailing ominous plumes of smoke and fire, yet still maintaining their deadly, unswerving trajectory. The sight of a plane already engulfed in flames, still plunging relentlessly towards a ship, was a chilling and unforgettable testament to the pilot's absolute, unwavering determination. When a kamikaze finally struck, the impact was catastrophic. A thunderous explosion that shook the very foundations of the ship, a massive geyser of flame and water erupting skyward, followed by the sickening crunch of tearing metal and the desperate screams of the wounded. The immediate result was often a ship engulfed in raging fires, its decks torn apart, its vital systems crippled, its crew scrambling frantically to fight the inferno and save their comrades, all while knowing with a cold dread that another divine wind could be just moments away, ready to complete the destruction. The consequences of the kamikaze attacks were devastating, both in terms of tangible material losses and perhaps even more significantly in their profound psychological impact. During the pivotal Battle of Okinawa, which raged from April to June 1945, kamikazes inflicted the heaviest casualties ever sustained by the U.S. Navy in a single battle throughout its history. Over 30 American ships were sunk outright, and more than 300 were damaged to varying degrees, ranging from minor hits to near-total destruction. Tragically, nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed, and many thousands more were wounded, some grievously. These staggering numbers alone speak volumes about the effectiveness of the tactic in inflicting direct damage and casualties. However, the true repercussions of the kamikaze strategy extended far beyond mere statistics. The constant, unrelenting threat of these suicidal attacks forced a complete and radical re-evaluation of naval tactics and defensive strategies. This led to the rapid development and deployment of enhanced anti-aircraft defenses, the implementation of more aggressive and continuous fighter patrols to intercept incoming threats further out, and, crucially, the widespread deployment of radar picket ships. These picket ships, often destroyers, were positioned far from the main fleet, acting as sacrificial lambs to absorb the initial waves of attack and provide early warning, knowing full well they were likely to be the first targets. The psychological toll on American forces was immense and pervasive. Combat fatigue, already a significant and debilitating issue in the prolonged and brutal Pacific campaign, reached unprecedented new heights. Sailors endured weeks, sometimes months, of continuous high-alert watches, the ever-present gnawing fear of a sudden unavoidable death from above. The dread was not just of dying, but of dying in a way that felt utterly random, inescapable and profoundly unfair at the hands of an enemy who had seemingly forsaken all conventional military logic and the basic human instinct for survival. Historically, the kamikaze phenomenon left an indelible and haunting mark on the narrative of World War II and, perhaps even more deeply, on the American psyche. It starkly underscored the extreme, almost unimaginable lengths to which Japan was willing to go to defend its sacred homeland, reinforcing the perception of an enemy that would fight to the bitter, absolute end, regardless of the cost. This perception played a profoundly significant role in the strategic calculations of the Allied command, particularly in the agonizing decision-making process that ultimately led to the use of atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The prospect of a full-scale conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, was projected by military planners to result in millions of casualties on both sides, a horrifying estimate that was partly due to the anticipated widespread use of kamikaze-style tactics by a civilian population thoroughly indoctrinated in the ethos of total war and self-sacrifice. The kamikaze remains a unique, chilling, and deeply disturbing chapter in military history, a stark and unforgettable example of how extreme desperation, combined with a powerful cultural and ideological framework, can lead to the weaponization of human life itself, challenging the very foundations of conventional warfare and pushing the moral boundaries of conflict to their absolute limit. It stands as a powerful and tragic testament to the immense power of ideological conviction, however tragically misguided, to drive individuals to the ultimate act of self-sacrifice. For many of the veterans who directly faced the terrifying onslaught of the kamikazes, the war did not truly end with the signing of the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri. The psychological scars ran deep, manifesting in persistent nightmares, debilitating lingering anxiety, and a profound, often lifelong difficulty in processing the utterly alien and terrifying nature of the enemy they had confronted. The indelible image of a plane burning fiercely and defiantly, hurtling relentlessly towards their ship, became an enduring and haunting symbol of the sheer terror and existential dread they had endured. It was a form of combat that defied easy explanation, rationalization, or conventional understanding, leaving many with a sense of profound existential dread and a unique form of trauma that few other combat experiences could ever hope to replicate. Their stories, often told years, even decades later, spoke not just of immense bravery and unwavering courage, but of a unique and extraordinary kind of resilience, forged in the crucible of facing an enemy who had fundamentally redefined the very meaning of threat and sacrifice. Their experiences served as a stark reminder that war can push humanity to its most extreme limits, revealing both the depths of desperation and the heights of human endurance. This is the true enduring legacy of the American experience facing the Japanese kamikaze pilots. It is a powerful and humbling proof that even in the darkest, most terrifying times, when confronted with an enemy driven by an absolute and unwavering conviction to sacrifice themselves, the human spirit in its myriad forms can endure, adapt, and ultimately prevail, one ship at a time, one gun emplacement at a time, one desperate, courageous act at a time. And in doing so, these men proved that the fundamental will to survive, tempered by immense courage, sharpened by strategic ingenuity, and ignited by the unwavering defense of freedom and the preservation of life, is ultimately stronger than any fanaticism, stronger than any suicidal attack, and more resilient than any weapon of war, no matter how terrifyingly conceived. Their story is a testament to the profound cost of conflict and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable terror.